Local news websites break my computer and I am so sick of it. Want to check the weather? Good luck. Want to read about last night's school board meeting? Sure, if you want to wait around 2 minutes for the page to load. And don't even get me started about those pop-up banners that jerk you around the page. Trying to click through one of your local news sites is like hell incarnate. But it wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, news websites were actually at the cutting edge of the internet for the 90s, offering sleek page design and quick load times. Also for the 90s. Websites were a point of pride for local outlets, somewhere where journalists and photographers could experiment with the future of news. But now, it's just a place where content goes to die in service of advertisements. So, how did we get here? Well, as a now former journalist, I have a pretty good idea as to why. This is a story about how corporate conglomeration, Google, and your average everyday American made your local news website suck. Hi, my name is Nathan Denzine, and like I said, I'm actually not a Big J journalist anymore, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, I was pretty good at it for a while there, so you can trust me. The news throughout much of modern history has been consumed via the newspaper. Pretty much as far back as America goes, and even a little bit farther, you can find a newspaper. Newspapers in this time started as partisan inventions where political parties would print their own news to get out to their base. The news was slanted, sure, but at least you know what angle it was coming from. But as time went on, the printing press got better and printing got cheaper, so more independent news outlets started to pop up. By about 1900, some of the major newspapers were actually pretty profitable, relying on two revenue sources: circulation, or the number of people actually buying the paper every day, and advertising, often in the classifieds or in full-page ads. Fast forward another 30 or 40 years, and the radio and TV started to pop up, which meant that you could now get your news for free, as long as you could afford the very expensive technology.
No limitations except the strength of our nation's desire and determination.
Public airwaves, unlike newspapers, are very heavily regulated, so they have to be free for people to access. So to make up for the circulation revenue that these broadcasters weren't getting, they started to introduce advertisements, and often those advertisements would come in full-length sponsorships.
The show is brought to you by Vim Laundry Detergent.
But because there were only like 4 television stations, attention was really concentrated, which means that broadcasters could charge a ton. But even though television and radio were these big fancy new things, newspaper circulation continued to rise through this era. In fact, daily newspaper circulation actually rose all the way until the mid-1980s. They peaked in 1984 with over 63 million Americans either subscribed to or buying a newspaper every single day. But at this point, television had started to eat into print journalism's market share, and newspapers started a very modest decline at this time. By 2000, when cable television had really hit its stride and the internet started to become more widely available for people, print journalism subscriptions were at about 55 million, a 12.5% drop since 1984. But that wasn't even close to the end of the fall. Today, with the most recent data from Pew Research, there are only about 21 million Americans who get a daily paper. That's 40 million fewer than in 1984, despite the American population growing by about 100 million. Instead of buying a paper, consumers today are much more likely to get their information from the internet. In fact, 58% of Americans now say that they get their news primarily from the internet, while only 4% are still reading their daily paper. And there's a really big difference between somebody actually buying a paper and somebody clicking on a link on a website. Take it as somebody who's set up a for-profit journalism website online. There's no money in it. I know that you've probably seen posts or felt yourself irritated that there was news behind a paywall, but you kind of have to understand that that's how it's been since the dawn of time. Before the internet, newspapers could rely on the sale of a newspaper to kind of shore up their other revenue sources when advertising fell short. But with the internet, that's all expected to just be free now. And because that's the way it started in the early days, and because people get pissed if it's behind a paywall now, news outlets are kind of forced to keep everything freely accessible online, especially if you're not one of the big boys like the New York Times. But that means that your local outlets now are almost fully reliant on online advertising. But before we get into any more of this nitty-gritty stuff, we have to talk about corporate consolidation in the news industry, we have to talk about Google's monopoly, and we have to talk about the financials that underlie all of this stuff. So there are 2 companies that own like all of the newspapers, Gannett and Lee Enterprises. Okay, there are actually about 7 companies, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to focus on the big 2. The pair have similar founding stories, both starting over 120 years ago as their own independent outlets, and both getting into the media consolidation business long before the internet. And while I'd love to talk about both, we only really have time for one, so we're going to focus on Gannett in this video. So between its founding in 2000, Gannett had gobbled up about 100 papers from around the country. Oh, and they had also launched USA Today. And while it had enjoyed considerable success in its first 100 years, Gannett knew that leading into the 21st century, the media landscape was much different than it was even 20 years ago. So Gannett Papers, like many others around the country, dove into the internet and started to experiment with what it could be. Gannett's specific claim to fame is that in 2005, they pioneered the concept of a mojo journalist, a journalist that goes out into the field and is responsible for video and pictures and the written content, and it's all going to be pretty much web exclusive stuff. Of course, all for free. Today, a mojo journalist would probably be considered an MMJ, which is just a journalist that's responsible for everything. And on the surface, something like an MMJ seems like it makes sense. With rapidly changing technology, journalists could now cover a lot more ground than they could before. But really, the turn towards making all of these journalists multimedia journalists was about corporate profits. Like we talked about before, when the internet became popular and everything was just being put out there for free, print subscriptions were falling off a cliff. Gannett knew that, and it knew that it needed a way to shed some of its expenses. And of course, the most expensive thing in any business is its employees. In 2007, Gannett eliminated 3,500 jobs. In 2008, they let go of somewhere near 1,000. And in 2009, they laid off about 4,600 people. Then in 2010, they decided it would be a good idea to increase the executives' pay and bonuses, with one executive being paid out $3.4 million, up from $1.9 million in 2009. Sure, fire close to 10,000 people and then give your executives close to an 80% raise. Good business move. And now you won't believe it, but somehow that money did not trickle down, and Gannett laid off another 700 people in 2011. In a message to employees, that executive that got the fat bonus wrote, "Well, we have sought many ways to reduce costs. I regret to inform you that we have not been able to avoid layoffs." What a dick. A few years down the road, Gannett had snapped up a whole bunch more papers, but revenue numbers were still struggling. That's when, in 2019, a private equity firm named New Media Investment Group stepped in and said that they would buy Gannett. New Media was in turn owned by Fortress Investment Group, another private equity firm. And at the time of the sale, Fortress was owned by SoftBank, a Japanese private equity firm. And SoftBank was able to fund the purchase with a $1.8 billion loan from Apollo Global, another private equity firm. Got it?
NBC owns Winnipeg Ironworks, which owns the Optionagi Party Meats Corporation of Pyongyang, North Korea.
And guess what happened when a global tetrahedron of private equity took over the news business? The new owners immediately said that they would find inefficiencies and lay people off.
Cutbacks.
When Gannett was acquired in 2019, they still had about 21,000 employees. Recording this a little bit later because I found some new data, but as of 2024, Gannett is down to just 8,300 employees. That means, by rough estimate, Gannett has lost 80% of its workforce, about 40,000 people, since 2000, which is just an absolutely diabolical gutting of America's news landscape. So that's the story of print journalism in the 21st century, but what about the TV side that I mentioned earlier? So there are also only like 3 companies that own every single broadcast station in America. Okay, technically there are a lot more than that, but there are 3 big guys: Nexstar, Sinclair, and Tenga. Tenga is interesting because it's actually a spin-off from Gannett, but Nexstar is currently trying to acquire Tenga, so we're just gonna focus on Nexstar and Sinclair in this section. Nexstar was founded in 1996 with the sole purpose of acquiring as many stations as they could, and boy oh boy, have they acquired a lot of stations. Nexstar currently owns or operates 197 stations around the country, and they're in just about every media market that you can imagine. If their acquisition of Tenga goes through, they would control over 250 stations. There are recent examples of what happens when one of these major media conglomerates take over your local station. Take, for instance, the 2% reduction of their entire workforce at the end of last year, or the endless Reddit threads that essentially say Nexstar will always cut positions and ask you to do more with less. Hi everyone, it has taken me so long to edit this video that I actually need to redo my section on Sinclair. First, let me just summarize what I was gonna say. Sinclair is the second largest broadcaster in the country, they lay people off all the time, and they have extremely conservative views. But the real reason I had to re-record this was because of Jimmy Kimmel and the FCC. Now, we're not here to debate what Jimmy Kimmel said. What we need to talk about is the FCC's pressure campaign on a private broadcaster and the monopolies that allowed this decision to even happen in the first place. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 is actually what allowed these companies like Sinclair to buy up all of our local broadcasting.
The whole media is controlled by a few corporations thanks to deregulation by the FCC.
And it means these companies have an outsized impact on what we consume on our TVs every day. Maybe not every day, but like sometimes. Trump said that Kimmel should be fired, and the head of the FCC that's appointed by Trump said that he might start revoking broadcast licenses if he wasn't. Now, the decision to suspend Kimmel was made by ABC's parent company, Disney, but we're talking about this in the Sinclair section because after the decision was announced, Sinclair put out a bonkers statement. In an official press release, Sinclair said that the suspension alone wasn't enough. They called for Kimmel to publicly apologize to Kirk's family and to make a sizable donation to Turning Point USA. And it's not the first time that Sinclair has forced politics into their local broadcast stations.
Biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets.
But Sinclair can just keep getting away with it because monopolies can do whatever the f they want because they have all of the bargaining power. Like putting so many ads on a website that it crashes your computer because where else are you gonna go for local news? And who even wants to support that kind of journalism or news?
And now I need to make an update to my update because Jimmy Kimmel was unsuspended by Disney, but guess what? Nexstar and Sinclair are both still preempting his show.
But even for independent newsrooms who don't have to answer to a company like Sinclair, there's another monopoly that forces them to cram their websites to the brim with advertisements. I think that most people who have never worked with Google AdSense before would be absolutely shocked at how little money it actually brings in. And here I can give you some real-world data from my experience. I actually used to run a sports website for a few years, and I have the financials to show that unless you're just doing it for a hobby, it's not really worth it. Over about 2 years running this website with advertisements, we got 123,000 total page views, and that translates to a grand total of $482.21. Or if you want to break it down, about $3.90 per 1,000 clicks. If that was for one story, I would say that was a pretty good payday. But I wrote 28 stories for this website, and the partner that I ran it with also wrote about the same number. So split that revenue that I said initially, pretend I spent about an hour and a half writing each one of these stories, and then add in about another 30 hours to build and maintain the site, run the math, and you get, congratulations to me! I made $3.30 an hour! Don't spend it all in one place. And while our views were a little low compared to established sites, I've also worked for established sites, and the numbers are not that much better. So as traditional revenue sources like circulation or really high-paying broadcast ad spots started to kind of go away, news publications had to cram their sites absolutely full of ads just to make up that difference. But that was if a reader even got to your site in the first place. Recent data from Google's antitrust case shows that Google makes the lion's share of ad revenue on the entire internet, and Facebook makes the second largest share, which is also a huge amount of money. So say your story was shared on Facebook and people didn't really click on it, they just read the title and the subhead, maybe left a comment or liked it and then went away. Facebook made all the ad revenue from that. Or let's say somebody Googles a question and Google AI pulls a result from something that you wrote onto their search page. Well, if they didn't click on your link, Google's getting all of that ad money. And even if a reader does make it to your website, there's a chance that Google has been fleecing you out of money for like 25 years. The biggest revelation from Google's antitrust case for me has been the percentage of advertisement that they take from publishers. So these other platforms take about 10% of the revenue for you using their software. Google takes 30%. So the only way to make up that extra 20% is to put 20% more ads on your screen. And when you do that, the website starts to perform terribly. Load times become ridiculously slow, your computer will temporarily use 100% of your processing power for no reason, and those pop-up ads will throw you all around the page on a whim, which makes the news worse, which makes less people read the news on your website, which means that you have to put more ads on your website, which means the news gets worse, which means less people visit your website, which means you have to put more ads You get the idea. I would argue the version of online news that we have right now is fatally flawed. Now, this could change a little bit in the coming years as Google's antitrust case continues to make its way through the court, because it's very likely that their AdSense business is taken away from Google, made into its own company, and then they might actually have to be competitive with these other softwares. But plain and simple, website ads alone are never going to compare to the old news model of advertisements in the papers plus circulation. And to give most newsmakers credit, they've realized that too. Gannett papers are now generally paywalled after 3 free articles a month, though that can differ by organization. And national desks like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal have very similar paywalls. And in fact, despite the annoyance of a paywalled article, there's actually some data that shows that this might work. Pew Research estimates that if you combine subscriptions with publicly available website traffic information, digital traffic is actually up 33% since 2019, which means that more people are going to news websites than ever before, and at least some of them are willing to pay for it. And if you pay for your journalism, suddenly that site that you're using gets a lot more usable. Which is probably not what you all wanted to hear. But the evidence that this system is unsustainable is right in front of us. The last holdout of this new media ecosystem was PBS and NPR, but recently he decided that we don't get free information anymore. So if you want to learn anything about this world, from 83% of casualties in Gaza being civilians to the thousands of homes that got flooded in your city, you're gonna have to pay up for it. Now, please don't misunderstand me and think that you have to subscribe to every single newspaper and every single outlet. You really do not have to do that. But as a former journalist, here's what I would suggest to all of you out there who want to stay informed. Pick one outlet that you really like, subscribe to them, end of list. Your support, an actual fixed value of money that you will give to them every single month, means so much more than the piddly ad revenue that you're giving them right now. No. No. If you just want to lay down, that's okay, but you're not going to want to lay down. Yeah. This little man.